adapting over coming. I think I may have to start again, guys, because I think the software didn't work well. So I maybe a false start. If you've heard me before, fine. But hello and welcome to everybody. I'm Peter Martin, Vice President of CGA, and your host for what is CGA's second webinar during lockdown, which today we are running in association with our friends Wireless Social. Today's title is resetting the course to recovery, and we'll be exploring the key factors which will influence how plans for reopening hospitality will evolve and adapt over the coming weeks and months. I think we've had over, well, almost 800 people register for today's online seminar, and it's a mix of operators and suppliers, which I suppose reflects the fact that we know that the pub, bar and restaurant sector is now deep in planning mode. Activity, I think, has really gone up a notch this week, with just over 30 days to July the 4th, which we all hope will be the day we start reopening the sector. Many operators I know been talking to this week are already bringing key team members back off furlough as they really start upping their preparations. Now, the way I suppose we look at the market and the factors which are going to shape how recovery starts really falls into 5 key areas. One is government, and that is going to be crucial in terms of the way our government timetable our return, the restrictions they put on it, but also the support they're giving us going forward. And obviously it's a big thanks to UK hospitality, who are spending a lot of time, face-to-face time with government, influencing them as much as possible, but also getting that detail back to communicate to the industry. The second big factor is going to be the financial strength of individual companies. That will really dictate how well people survive through these crucial next weeks and months. Then it's the resolve and creativity of those management teams and their staff, how they are going to adapt to these new trading areas once we get going. And then the last two, the willingness of the consumer to return, and then the wider economic and business environment that hospitality will re-emerge into. And it is those last 2 areas we really want to focus on today, and particularly the consumer. So let's have a look at what the agenda is telling us for today. What have we got in store for you? Well, that's the welcome, that's me. We're going to be looking at where we are now, particularly in terms of consumers and what the market outside is doing, where we're heading, and what we can learn from other markets. We've been doing some research at CGA in China and also the US. And then what does that mean for recovery? The first part of the presentation is going to be handled by Carl Chesel, Retail and Food Director at CGA, and Emma Causer, Chief Customer Officer at Wireless Social. So let me welcome those on screen at the moment who are going to take us through the first bit of the presentation. That's probably going to take half an hour or so, and if you've got any questions, please fill those in. So let's have a look at the housekeeping slide as well, which tells you how this is all going to work. It is being recorded, so if you're a bit late in or have to go away, don't worry, we'll get the final recordings to you. But the key thing is how you can put your own questions. You can write them in, and I will take those and put them to our panel. And then we'll be joined, and then also you can follow it on Twitter as well. After this first session, we're also going to be joined by Johnny Jones, Director of Client Services at CGA, who's going to talk about what suppliers are up to. And then we're going to finish up with our special guest today, the Chief Executive Alchemist, Simon Potts. A lot of the market talk has been around the reopening of restaurants and pubs, but we're going to look at the bar sector, which is probably going to be more difficult. So I'm really looking forward to that at the end. But as I say, questions for all those as we go along. So let's see about you, the audience. If you remember when you registered, we asked you some questions about how you're working and where you come from. The split is about 50-50 at the moment between operators and suppliers. But of those operators, we wanted to get a sense of where your planning is at the moment, because we know that's evolving over time. We know that 60% of you are predicting actually to reopen all your sites as well, but there's 40 who won't. And that's quite interesting going forward. Just around half of you expect to have at least 80% of your sites up and running by September as well. And if you look on the left of your screen as well, as 24 of you expect to really open with all guns blazing, as it were, with all your sites open, but the majority of you are going to phase it. As I say, half of you expect to have the bulk of your estate open by September. 11% of you are delaying, and perhaps that's because of your bigger sites, so perhaps we can help with that today. And 30% of you don't know yet, so let's hope we do are able to provide some answers for you then. Anyway, enough of me. Let's go on with the guts of today, which is our main presentation from Carl and Emma. And as I say, a special thanks to be working with Wireless Social today. Carl, Emma, over to you guys.
Thank you, Peter. Hopefully everyone can hear me clearly. So in terms of what we're going to cover, Peter sort of outlined some of the broad areas. I think for us, it's actually really exciting now. This is the second webinar, as Peter said, that we've done during lockdown, but this is the first one really focusing on the recovery. And we have a date to all gun for of the 4th of July. Now, clearly, the path to that 4th of July and beyond is not necessarily going to be smooth, but hopefully what we share today will be a real view on where we are now, sort of how we got there, but actually most of the presentation is where are we heading, what are consumers telling us about how they like to behave when the hospitality sector opens and when they return to the sector. And as Peter touched on, what can we learn from other markets? So I'm particularly going to look at China and what we can learn from that about our recovery. And finally, sort of what that all means for everyone. As Peter said on the webinar, we have both operators and suppliers, hopefully to make sense of that, what sort of decisions need to be made and how can data insight help inform them. So I think Emma's going to do the first piece, which is part of the where are we now, but also how we got there. So using some of the great insight that Wireless Social have around footfall, I'm going to hand over to Emma to talk through some of the light that sheds on our current situation.
Cheers, thanks Carl. So I just wanted to basically go back to kind of prior to lockdown and how it panned out and what happened. And you can see kind of if we go back to the new year, we started to get stories around a virus, a flu-like virus coming from China. And I don't think it felt very real then. It seemed to be something that was happening on the other side of the world. But on January the 29th, the first case was discovered here in the UK in York, and there were 2 Chinese nationals who fell ill. And then if we can see a week later on the 6th of February, a British businessman, he came home from Singapore, and the data shows, just a short dip behind. So the period after included half-term week, which is traditionally the 3rd week in February. It's the same across the whole of Europe, and everybody tends to go away. And then on February the 28th, the first case that was caught in the UK emerged, and you can see straight after that, the data starts to show an impact. So without any government intervention, we can start to see that people's behaviour started to change and they started to not venture out as much. Then on the 5th of March, very sadly, that's when the first death occurred. And although there was a footfall spike just prior, we think anecdotally that might just be people going out to do a bit of panic buying. But then by the 16th of March, the government issues a statement saying, please avoid all unessential travel, work from home and avoid all social venues. And you can really see between the 16th then and the 23rd, when we went into full lockdown, how there's a 40% drop off. And many venues were open then, but many venues took the decision to close. And understandably, that had a massive impact on revenues. So just moving on to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to focus in on the first 3 weeks of lockdown. It hovers around, footfall is at around -80%. We tend to see a change around Sundays, and I'll show you some data on that more. That tends to be the least compliant day. But Easter weekend stands out. It was a fantastically sunny weekend. It was a 4-day holiday. It's traditionally a holiday where everybody gets out and about, and that shows the data shows that we were at our most compliant. Everybody stayed at home and they really did listen to the government advice. So moving on to the second 3 weeks of lockdown, once again we see we see an uptick again on Sundays, and that's something that really shows through in the entire lockdown, is that it is the least compliant day. But there is a slight change at the beginning of May. There's an uptick, but it's good weather, and we're seeing lots of pictures of people on beaches and people going in busy streets, and the data doesn't really show that. People are still being compliant, but there does appear to be hotspots of people going out, but it's not borne out across the UK. So the first 6 weeks of lockdown, what we do know is that London has a much higher kind of footfall during the whole of lockdown, and there's probably lots of reasons for this. London has a much lower age demographic than the rest of the UK, and we're starting to break that data down because we think that's going to be really useful going forward. We need to know, what the age demographics are, who are continuing to go out, because they're going to be a key part of the re-emergence. London, we also know, is predominantly flats. There's no gardens, not many people have outside space. Londoners tend to venture out more to utilise the outside space, and they are also reliant on public transport, and that's not the case across the rest of the country. So VE Day was an interesting one. Obviously, that was supposed to be a really big celebration across the UK. There was lots of things planned, and pretty much everything got cancelled. And what we did see is, once again, strong compliance with the government stay at home. And what we did see on the news is that anecdotally there's lots of kind of socially distanced parties on driveways. Even again, glorious bank holiday weekend, but people didn't go out, they listened to the government advice. We know that London did have a fly past that went completely across the whole of London, and that probably would have pushed people outdoors, so there's going to be a higher footfall in London, but on the whole people did behave. So what we do know is that the different devolution governments approach lockdown in a different way. Scotland and Wales maintained the stay-at-home message for much longer, and this clearly shows in the data. London is, the least compliant, but Cardiff, Edinburgh and Glasgow, pretty much through till the end of last month, were extremely compliant. Everybody stayed at home and listened to the government advice. So this now takes us into a breakdown that I think it's utterly fascinating, and for me it's been the most interesting to look at. So we can see, kind of going back to the beginning of this, we're going to split out the data into 4 different parts. We've got Canary Wharf, we've got the Square Mile, which is the city, we've got the West End, and we've got London Villages. It shows, number one, how much school holidays can affect footfall, because you can clearly see that half term there is a drop off there. But from the 6th of March onwards, there is a significant drop off. Now, the 2 areas that have had the most drop off have been the city and Canary Wharf. West End to an extent, but the 2 that are kind of consistently across those 2 areas. The areas that are benefiting are the London Villages, and those are places like Islington, Hampstead, Richmond, etc. We've got more detail of what they are, but the most significantly impacted area is Canary Wharf. We know this area is predicated on offices. There is little or no residential there, and it shows clearly here that even when lockdown is eased, you can see that there is just no change whatsoever in the data. We also know anecdotally that working patterns are changing, and they are unlikely to return to where they are. The Barclays CEO, he's already said that he's going to start with, he stated that putting 7,000 people in a building is going to be consigned to history. And they are one of the largest employers in Canary Wharf. So we are watching with interest to see how that footfall continues to be impacted there. The city, we know, is not faring much better. They do have the slight benefit of having more residential areas, and alongside the West End, they are showing, really tiny increments of recovery. But as I've said, the London Villages, the areas that are benefiting, they're doing really well. People are staying at home, they're working from home, they're exercising locally, and they are shopping locally as well. So what the office areas are losing, London Villages are gaining, and we expect this kind of behaviour, to be replicated across the UK. So what we can see is that people's behaviours are changing and new behaviour patterns are being adapted. And the key, I think, to success in the future is going to be understanding those new behaviours and being able to communicate with your customers on those new behaviours. I think the challenge for business districts is going to be a much lesser number of customers for the time being. There's going to be increased competition for the business, and you've got to get to grip with that new customer landscape really quickly and understand who it is that's coming through your front door and how you get them back time and time again. So I've just split out that there between Canary Wharf and the city, and so that people can see the split between the two. And then finally, Sundays, we identified very quickly into lockdown that actually Sundays were the least compliant day. And what you can also see is that Sunday just gone is that we are now back at minus 62.2%, but we are now back where we were pre-lockdown on the 22nd of March. So there is a recovery in place, and we know that things like people going back to work and going back to work in offices potentially, and children going back to school are going to drive further behavioural changes. And that's basically a very quick high-level summary of the wireless social data from lockdown and how we're starting to emerge. So over to you, Carl, for the next bit.
Thanks, Emma. That's really, really interesting. I think it shows how well data tells a story, and also in particular how we have seen this drop in football, but it's not uniform by geography and also by consumer group. And I think it'll be fascinating to plot that as we continue to move forward. Emma touched a little bit on consumer behaviour. Just to finish off this section, I'm going to talk about consumer behaviour during lockdown. So we've seen how it's impacted on footfall. This one feels a fairly obvious slide in many ways, but most people, almost everyone, is concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on their health and the health of their families. If anything, I'm surprised it's not higher. It'll be really interesting for us to track that, I think, as we move into the recovery. So as consumers do come to the market, as lockdown eases, not just in hospitality, but in other sectors, how much confidence there will be amongst consumers and how much concern will there be around health. I think it'll be really interesting to track that metric. I think more nuanced, though, is actually the health concerns obviously are very, very highlighted by global pandemic, but actually people are taking their personal health much more taking much more interest in their personal health in lots of other areas as well. So people are buying healthier foods, they're stopping buying unhealthier foods, and they're certainly exercising more. So nearly 40% of people are exercising more through this period. So we are seeing some behavioural changes. Now, health obviously isn't a new trend, but I think it's certainly been amplified and magnified during this lockdown period. In terms of drinks and alcohol consumption, we've seen a range of different habits. Overall, there's been a net decrease in alcohol consumption. So some people have cut out alcohol completely. Obviously, one of the major channels to enjoy alcohol in relation to great experiences is in the on-trade. And with that channel being closed, it's not surprising that some people have cut down, some people are drinking less. There are some people drinking more, a majority of people pretty much sticking to the same amount of alcohol, but more people are drinking less, if that's not an oxymoron. So the net effect is an overall decline in alcohol consumption amongst consumers. As they've had to shift channel from on-trade into home for this short period, what we've seen is there are some categories that have been hardest hit. So it's very hard to replicate that cocktail experience. And obviously Simon can talk much more intelligently about this later, but having a mixologist to create a great cocktail with great theatre and the great experience that goes with it is much more difficult in your own home. So people have turned away from that category for the time being. People have also reduced their consumption of categories like ale, craft and stout. So categories that people associate with a quality serve in the on-trade. In terms of what people have been doing with their time, well, as well as exercising, we've seen a big increase in people having virtual gatherings. So we remain social beings. People are playing board games, coming together as families, but a lot of that is in a virtual sense, and not just through the likes of Zoom, but also sort of quizzes and apps like House Party have been used extensively. People looking at live events. I think what's interesting, we look at some of these, had hot food delivered, restaurant quality food using recipes or ingredients from restaurants, having a big night in your household. It shows a desire, I think, to replicate there's great experiences with getting the on-trade in home. So a few people have asked me if we see this as a threat to the on-trade. I don't think so. I think it's people making the best of the current situation and trying to create those social experiences in a slightly different way. In terms of the habits that we expect to stick, so we asked consumers, and this is all based on our consumer research carried out last month, brand tracks, it's around 5,000 consumers, so a really robust sample. 42% say they're going to continue with these virtual gatherings. They've enjoyed that element of socialisation, and that's likely to continue. I think probably more interesting for this sector is that nearly 1 in 3 are choosing to make restaurant quality food, use recipes or ingredients from restaurants, and they're expecting this to continue. So we've seen operators pivot into providing their own recipes online so people can create their dishes at home, people providing recipe kits, people like Coat at Home delivering chilled food that can go straight in the oven. So this is something that I think provides an opportunity for operators to create a more omni-channel experience with their brands. So it's not all doom and gloom. In terms of where are we heading then? So that's sort of where we are, and some of those behavioural changes we think may stick. In terms of customer sentiment and return to hospitality, so this is obviously GB consumers talking about how they might behave. So 22% are saying they would feel comfortable resuming visits to the out-of-home as soon as government restrictions are lifted. So there's a reasonable segment of the population that are happy to return to normal as soon as they're allowed, but obviously it is a minority. Actually, the people that were more loyal to the sector and more frequent visitors are the people that are perhaps more likely to return quickest. So you can see it's a busy chart this, but the people that go multiple times a week, 29% of them would be comfortable doing so as soon as restrictions are lifted. And as you get to lower frequency, people are more cautious or perhaps less likely to go out. The other key pattern is that it's age related as well. So younger people are much more comfortable returning to the sector quicker. So 18 to 24-year-old, 28% of them, versus you look at 65 plus year olds, only 16% of them are comfortable resuming visits to out of home as soon as restrictions are lifted. So it's very much going to depend on who your customers are, what your customers look like, as to how perhaps they're going to react and interact with your outlets and therefore your products moving forward. We've identified 4 broad segments, and this is focused on food-led visits, but so 19% who have regular frequency and will continue to do so. We have 45%, a big chunk of people that eat out frequently, at least monthly, and will continue to eat out, but with caution. I think this sort of third segment is really interesting, and we're doing lots of deep dives for clients. Appreciate them. There's a lot of detail behind all this, but that third segment, 21%, they did eat out fairly frequently recently, so at least monthly, and are now suggesting that their frequency will dip. So I think that's a concern, and why overall we'd like to see a cautious return to the sector. We'd like to see footfall down, and we'd like to see sales down. So there are still going to be some ongoing challenges, even though obviously it's very exciting that we have an open date to work to. In terms of that cautious return and what people are looking for, the consumers are telling us very clearly they need some element of personal distance, so tables and seats being moved apart. Social distancing measures are important. Whether that's 2 meters or whether that comes down is obviously a question for debate, but people need that comfort. I think they also need it really well communicated to them as well. So it's obviously not just a case of putting these checks in place, it's making consumers, giving them reassurance that your venues are safe environments to come to, and also safe for your workers as well. So things like free hand sanitizer will be made available. 60% of them would like that to be the case. People looking for enhanced cleaning protocols. So there's a lot of operational changes that are being demanded by customers to sort of help with that cautious return. The types of occasions that are most likely to quickly return are things like informal catch-ups, like catch up with friends, regular everyday occasions. Also still elements of treat and celebration though that the on-trade does so well. And certainly not the kind of large gatherings in big groups, which is why, as Peter touched on earlier, certain sectors of the market may be slower to open and customers will potentially be slower to return. So looking at China, as Peter said earlier, we've not just done research in China, we've done research in US and also in other countries, but I think China is a good example of a country that obviously went into lockdown, has now reopened, and we conducted some research 4 to 6 weeks after the lockdown was eased there and people were able to return to the out-of-home sector. And what we saw was a polarisation really. Almost half the consumers had returned, so 48% had visited a pub, restaurant or bar since lockdown was lifted, but frequency had definitely been hit. So again, this sense of a cautious return. And actually, again, mirroring what I talked about in GB and what we expect to see in GB, 60% of those that ate and drank out weekly returned quickest. So that loyal core are likely to be the people that return to the sector quickest. And that's good. These are good spenders. They come regularly. But again, these consumer groups are not consistent across all brands and all types of venue. In terms of the sort of changes that consumers were looking for in China, obviously it's different for every country. So they have a very efficient track and trace system. They also have a green light QR code that people can carry on their phones. So technology is playing a part to reassure customers. But they're also looking for some of those same things I talked about that GB consumers are going to be looking for. So fewer tables, more space, protective equipment coming up, additional hygiene programs, disposable drinkware and silverware. So again, these are things that people want to see to give them some comfort that the places they're going to are catering for their new needs. It's not surprising, therefore, that when you ask consumers about the very important factors in choosing where to visit post-COVID, that hygiene standard comes up there on the left. So 45% are absolutely demanding of that exceptional high standard of hygiene. It's grown from the 31% pre-COVID. What actually surprised me looking at this slide is they're also looking for the bar to be raised around a whole lot of other areas fairly fussily. Additional quality of food, additional quality of drinks, good service. They want improvement there. And I think whether this will translate to GB, where I think the bar is already incredibly high, remains to be seen. But I think it does show that I know some operators are thinking about potentially a reduced menu, reduced drinks range. I think that's going to be a sort of strange and maybe difficult circle to square, that if you start doing that for obvious reasons, with supply chain being interrupted, with reduced revenue in terms of footfall, it could be a dangerous strategy, because it may well switch off certain customers who do have very high expectations of the sector already and may need more reason to get off their sofa, frankly, to enjoy the great experiences the on-trade has to offer. We've seen both in GB but also in China a renewed community pride. So people are more interested in local, and that's also reflected in where people are likely to go out. And also the important thing in China, this isn't just talking about what people might do, this is talking about what they have done. So people have more frequently visited local bars and restaurants. When you look at where people have visited less frequently, it's been city centre bars and restaurants. So this sort of echoes some of the footfall data that Emma was talking about. So a combination of maybe people working from home more. So you can see here the sort of habits that people took into lockdown that have continued to do so. So in China, it's about this health hasn't gone away. As I said earlier, what's happened in this process, it's magnified some of the trends that already existed. So health, sourcing environmental ingredients, buying local, delivery. So these have become more and more important. But also alcoholic drinks have particularly become important. We've seen a lot of operators pivot into providing curbside drop-off or takeaway for drink, and that's seen as something that in China people are continuing to do that. In terms of category, I think this is interesting, where I talked earlier that actually in terms of what people are drinking at home versus in pubs, bars and restaurants, there are certain categories that have been hit, but actually when the doors opened again, it's kind of returned to normal on a category basis. So people are going back to drinking cocktails now that they can get a good cocktail in the on-trade. And so generally the sort of categories are fairly consistent with pre-lockdown, and then we haven't seen a big behavioural shift pre-lockdown to post-lockdown. And the other thing, and Peter highlighted this at the start, one of the kind of core 5 areas, is what's going to happen to the global economy. And nobody knows for certain, other than clearly this is a fundamental event that is likely to have lasting impacts financially. So in China, nearly 3 in 4 are concerned about the long-term financial implications. So when you look beyond the health concerns, the sort of reassurance they need to return to the sector, that financial concern is weighing heavily on people. So we have seen an overall reduction in average weekly spend, so nearly 10% lower spend for eating and drinking out amongst Chinese consumers. So not only has frequency been lower, but spend has been lower. So I think this is an understandable concern, I think, when we look at the GB market. So my final section then, just to sort of summarise in part, but also I think to focus on some of the areas that people need to really double down on as we plan for this return to hospitality and whatever the new normal looks like. The great thing, as I said, is that we have a countdown now. So it's just over a month to the 4th of July. Some people are looking to open their whole estate. So Wetherspoons have gone public with that. They're also using technology. They obviously have an app already, but they're going to introduce table service with that. We've got Green King. So CEO Nick McKenzie is talking about how they're going to use phones to provide orders that can be sort of table service in beer gardens. So lots of operators are looking at new ways of working. And I think they've also been really transparent about that. So many of you may have seen the good interviews Open Inns did on TV recently, showing how their venues will be safe to return. I think this is really important, this area of communication, so consumers have that reassurance. Tattoo have also done a really good job there of showing how that's going to be safe for consumers, but also safe for their own people as well. And in terms of what business leaders are going to focus on, so increased hygiene is understandably important. Increased focus on as the communication of those hygiene initiatives important. And these sort of, on the one hand, could be seen to dwarf some of the other issues, but actually there are some important changes that people are going to make around reducing food menu items, reducing drink menu items. And so we have seen a disruption in the food and drink chain. So how quickly suppliers can re-engage and collaborate with operators, I think is going to be really, really important challenge for the sector. But as I say, a word of caution is if things are reduced too much and the offer becomes a little bit more dumbed down, then that may be a challenge to footfall for consumers as well. So it's quite a difficult challenge, I think, that operators are going to have to face. And the one thing we have seen, though, as talked about earlier, is the importance of workers and people. And hospitality is a people business, so being able to deliver an experience face to face is obviously what people are missing and what the sector does brilliantly. Now, obviously, because there are still going to be financial pressures on operators, the lever of increasing wages just doesn't exist for people at the moment. So it's about what value operators can provide to their workers to basically build long, sustainable careers, which I know many operators are really working collaboratively with people like UK Hospitality, but also really passionate about themselves. And therefore, it is going to be about reviewing and enhancing culture. And people have spent the lockdown making sure they connect and communicate with people, even those on furlough. So people have been allowed to train, obviously, during that furlough period, which is great. And the work that I know our sister company CPL have done with UK Hospitalities around their pathways, is providing free access to courses, has gone down really, really well, and creating engagement, and also hopefully make sure that people are match ready for that return. But there's a lot of focus on making sure that staff feel reassured, but also on that culture. As I said, we know that frequency will take time to return. We know that consumer behaviour will be different for some consumer groups. So understanding how it affects your consumers is going to be really, really important, because it's going to be a slow return to normal. Maybe as we get towards a year from now, we might see some form of normality in terms of frequency to the sector, but it will take time. We're going to see, as Emma talked about, a reluctance potentially to visit cities and town centres. So this came out clearly in our business leader research, which was conducted a few weeks ago. We shared in a webinar, and that increased desire to support local, but also to stay local. And that comes up clearly again in this consumer research. So we asked consumers, how concerned you would be about visiting city and town centres? And the proportion of consumers who are very concerned is much lower in city centres. So if you live in city centre, only 15% of them are concerned about going out to their local environment. But if you live in the suburbs, that number grows quite significantly to 40%. So people that live in the suburbs are much more likely to stay local to enjoy hospitality in those environments, at least initially. We know the shape of the market will look different. Peter talked about this earlier, and we've got some business leader projections that the market could be 20–30% smaller, but it's going to be a phased approach as well. So I think for us, when we started doing this 25 years ago, so this is sort of CGA's bread and butter, if you like, but we're going to double down on this and have a kind of laser focus on this, being able to understand where's opening, when it's opening. And that's obviously critical for operators, because it will help drive footfall. Are people being drawn to your venues, in and around your venues? So you need to think about opening there. What's the level of competition near your sites? But also for suppliers, which places are open and trading, and maybe also which of them are offering delivery, because we know, again, there will be that growth towards delivery. I don't think we can underplay, though, this financial challenge that we may face. We don't know how deep a recession we're going to have. We don't know what shape it's going to be. There's people much more qualified than me that are debating that, but there is a concern amongst consumers. You can see 85% are concerned about the long-term financial implications of COVID. And when we've asked these sorts of questions in the past about if you had less money or if the price of eating and drinking went up, what impact would that have on your behaviour? And one of the key things that came out was that people weren't necessarily, we've seen premiumisation go on and on, people aren't necessarily looking to trade down, but it will hit frequency. So more people like to eat at the same places, but with lower frequency. And this again is an area that we're really going to explore in terms of those financial impacts in our next brand track survey in a couple of months' time. Actually, it's going to go live in a few weeks. So my final slide then, for us, and we're a data insight company, so to an extent we would say this, but I believe this more than ever now in what is a really challenging time. We're not seeing subtle changes, we're going to see a fundamental shift. Really understanding what's going on is absolutely fundamental. We know the sector will bounce back, it's going to take time, but understanding how the market's opening, where it's opening, how does footfall flow back to different parts of the market, how is it changing by location, by day of week. I think understanding that and how that aligns to sales, and that's one of the reasons we're really excited about working with Wireless Social, how we can align both sales performance, do things like Coffee Peach with the footfall data, through our EPOS sharing. How can you understand market share by segment if you're an operator, but also if you're a supplier, what's your share of segment, what's your share of region, how can you map that when the pace of change is going to be even quicker than ever. Understanding continually not just what consumers are saying now, but how their behaviour changes. As I said, that was one of the reasons we really wanted to share that China research, and we have a much more detailed report around that, because we know that consumers will change their behaviour, and what they're saying now might be different to 4 weeks to 8 weeks, that you need to get to really understand that, but also what it means for your consumers. I couldn't stress that enough. The whole market isn't going to be the same. Obviously, there's massive operational changes that people need to implement and think about how you communicate. But finally, this final point of how offer should evolve, operators are no challenging themselves with, is that opportunity around omnichannel? How big an opportunity is delivery? Now is the time to maybe really leverage that. Also with delivery at home and people taking dishes like codes at home, how much of the future is that? With people like Leon operating partly as grocery stores, is that here to stay? We'd seen it pre-lockdown with things like Mama Go and Zara from Pizza Express, people spinning their brands into other environments. But I think this is an area that will become more and more important. So just from my perspective, to try to end on a positive, I think there's a lot to map and a lot to understand, but I do think the market will come back. I think as consumers, we want those social experiences, but the market won't be the same. Consumers won't be the same. So I think it's going to be more important than ever to understand as much as possible what that market looks like. So that's my final slide. I'm going to, I think, stop sharing, and then I think Peter may see if there's any Q&A before obviously speaking to the likes of Johnny and Simon.
Well, thank you, Carl and Emma. That was great. We do have some questions here as well. I mean, first one for you, Emma, actually. Can you, and into the technical question, sorry about that. I think a lot of people have asked, including Emma from Tesco's, about actually how you get that footfall data.
So we have the ability that within the Wi-Fi we have sensors, and then basically that pings out every single kind of phone or anything that comes nearby, and it just pings backwards and forwards and receives that data, and then we just analyze that. I mean, there's a huge amount, and then we just analyze that, aggregate it at a really high level, and then we can turn that into footfall data. That's a very simplistic view, by the way, what it is.
If anyone wants a written answer, I'm sure they can get one.
So I can give you a more detailed one, but to keep it, it's something that it's quite complicated, but basically it gathers as people pass by with their mobile phones. They don't necessarily need to be connected to the Wi-Fi.
There's a question here which follows on from that, Emma. People are asking, do you think the Cummings effect has had what effect that had on your footfall? Or is that pure speculation? Because, I mean, what we have seen is that there are footfall is certainly getting higher in London villages, and I think London is higher than other cities, but in a sense, it's still not back to anywhere near normal, is it yet?
No, but I think there's still a lot of things that, most of the shops are closed, hospitality is closed, schools are closed. So all the things that would drive footfall further, they're still restricted. And I think the Cummings effect, it could only be anecdotal what I could tell you. We haven't looked at that in detail, but I do think, it's principally made people look at their behaviour and go, well, if the people in government do it, then it looks like we can do it. I think, there was a significant change towards the end of May, and that is borne out, that is fact in the data.
And obviously what we're seeing, and it's a whole point about what we're talking about today, we'll be measuring that as we go on week by week as well. And I think that's going to be really important in the next 30 days.
Yeah, I think we're quite excited about looking at that, because we can see, really distinctive areas, where people are going to have real challenges about opening up businesses, and it has to make you think, is it worth doing? And I think as each part of the country reopens, we'll be able to look at how that affects footfall.
And I think from our point of view, collaboration, and we're showing it, is one of the words I've heard a lot of this last week, and the fact that what you've got on footfall and what Carl and his team are going to be looking at market recovery monitor, as we're now calling it, in terms of where people are actually opening and correlating those is going to be really important. Carl, can I come to you? Because another question is, and I think I do know the answer to this, it's about have we been tracking takeaway drink deliveries, and in fact we haven't really, because the problem is most of the big chains, or even small chains, we get data from Copper Peach Business Tracker, actually have furloughed most of their finance teams. So we haven't. We are going to be picking that up a bit more, aren't we?
We are, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we obviously did track delivery previously. We were in the process of launching a hospitality at home tracker to track delivery sales, and we had a lot of interest in that. And then I think, as you say, a lot of people were focused on delivery and then decided against it, some of it for staff safety concerns. But I think as the market reopens further, I think people will focus on delivery as a channel, and I think tracking that channel is going to be absolutely fundamental. So yeah, it's absolutely on our radar to continue to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's another question here about asking if we think the replication of the restaurant experience at home will continue. In a sense, we don't know yet, do we? But we will. The answer is we'll be tracking it.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously ask consumers their intended behaviour. I think that's why we were interested to look at China, because that's getting past what people think they will do, when it's quite hard, when we're still moving through a pretty rapid changing landscape to what people are actually doing. So I think that you're right, that ability for us to continue to track how sentiment changes, how intended behaviour, and then how actual behaviour changes and manifests itself in terms of footfall, in terms of sale, in terms of delivery sales. These are going to be fundamental metrics, as well as actually where is open, because as you said right at the start, it's not going to be the same market as it was previously, unfortunately.
Well, we've got some more questions coming through, and we'll probably pick those up later. One is about tracking and what were the top 5 occasions before lockdown, and I think we'll get back to people on these as well, because we know where they're coming from. And I think the other perhaps we will talk about is value for money, that actually although people are going to be tight for cash, there's no doubt about that, particularly as we go into recession as well, which we are. How value for money is going to play, because that's not necessarily a big driver at the moment, is it?
No, it's not been. I mean, we've talked for this for a while, really. People have been focused on quality and that quality of the experience they get. So it's been more about the value of experience than value in monetary terms. I think, as I touched on one of my slides, we have seen previously where prices have spiked, or where people's purses have been squeezed, then people have actually been a bit more cautious about going out, but haven't wanted to downtrade their experiences. So I think that's an area we're really going to deep dive into in our next brand track surveys. I think it's going to be fascinating, as inevitably a lot of the focus through this pandemic has been on the health implications and how we reassure people about that. I think the financial implications, could be long lasting. Hopefully they're not, but that's a real concern. So there's a sense of, will that premium stay? Will the value, could it even be the mainstream that's squeezed? We have our theories, but I think it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out when we ask consumers about their intended behaviour.
Yeah, fine. Well, thanks. There's another one here, which I'll pick up as well, about asking questions about what people want to see when going back. And someone's asking, did we ask about staff wearing protective equipment? And in fact, I mean, from that data, what I know is there's a whole range of other areas which are lower down the pecking order, including contactless payment. And I think, you know, what I'd say to people in the business is those are the extra ones you can add on to those basics to actually, you know, do a belt and braces approach and really make sure that people feel safe and reassured to come back, because that is the main thing coming through. And I think what I think was really interesting about the China research is that what people are saying in UK, that they are going to avoid crowds in city centres and go local, is exactly what's happening in China. And also from the States, we're seeing that people are looking for perhaps going for drinking casual dining restaurants rather than bars, because it's potentially they feel safer and less at risk. So I think those things will pan out. But thank you both. I mean, a lot more research to come in the next 30 days before people hopefully
Absolutely.
start opening their doors again. Yes, the final question is, yes, you can get hold of a copy of the deck. But for the moment, Carl, Emma, thanks very much. And now we're going to welcome Johnny Jones from CGA. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
Johnny, come and join me, please. Now, Johnny, you don't know him, is Director of Client Services, who spent a lot of time talking to the big drinks companies. I thought it's worthwhile bearing in mind we've got a lot of people from the supply side as well, and obviously getting the drinks offer back up is pretty key. Johnny, what are you hearing from the sort of conversations you're having with the big drinks companies and some of the smaller drinks companies as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Peter. Yeah, I think similar to operators, really. End of March, beginning of May was all about looking at how we could save cost. And people have done that effectively by using the furlough scheme and looking at other non-committed budgets. But then what we have seen is a fast move into planning. So people have been doing a lot of forecasting around the different scenarios that they predict the on-trade will reopen with, what that means for market volumes and for their own brands. That's helping them support their demand planning processes and their channel strategies. And then also they've been looking at any ways that they can help support their key customers, both through lockdown and throughout the recovery as well. We've seen some really good initiatives coming through there.
Because obviously one of the areas is that people want deferred payment, and that sort of came through on some of our research as well. But obviously everybody is in pretty tight straits at the moment. I mean, what's the attitude to helping out financially?
Yeah, I think what we've got to remember is that suppliers' businesses have been hit as well. So about 40% of alcohol volume is sold in the on-trade, but it's obviously sold at a much higher price. So profit for most of our supplier clients is skewed much more towards the on-trade. So they've taken a big hit as well. So there will be the bigger suppliers who are able to offer some of those flexible payment terms. But I think there needs to be very much a partnership approach between suppliers and operators on this to make sure that we can reach solutions that work for everybody.
But what are some of the more imaginative schemes coming out? I mean, people are talking about prepaid voucher schemes, things like that, to help encourage and work together. A lot of people taking those things up.
Yeah, I think that's one of the good ones we have seen, and we've seen a major brewer getting involved in that. So they're looking at prepaid vouchers for local pubs, and then matching the value of those vouchers, so helping to drive footfall and spend into their customers' outlets. We've seen spirit suppliers helping with training and certified training. So going back to what Carl said earlier about making sure that people are match fit coming back into the trade. And then we've also seen help with some of the other pain points that you've touched on as well. So one of the major brewers has recently released an app which helps with customer loyalty, but also payment and ordering. So taking away that operational challenge of menus and paying at the till. And then we've seen other partnerships being formed as well. So spirits suppliers partnering with third-party delivery services, for example, to deliver cocktails throughout lockdown and keep that revenue flowing, but also keep engagement with the consumers. So some really good initiatives there. And we're seeing similar in the States and through our China research as well.
What are the expectations of the drinks companies? Are they similar to operators in terms of sort of scale and phasing of openings and sort of a level of recovery?
Yeah, I think they're obviously very close to their key customers, so their expectations are pretty well aligned now to the way that the operators are thinking. So everyone's expecting a phased reopening between now and potentially the end of the year, beginning of 2021. But they are also concerned that operators are telling us that not all of the market is going to come back. And as you saw in the last webinar, when we look at that by channel, we can see that anywhere between 15 and 25% of the market potentially won't return. So it's a big concern for them going forwards in terms of what that means for volumes. Will that spread out across the remaining outlets, or will we see a fundamental drop in consumption?
Yeah, because obviously, actually, you're probably helping align those expectations, because CGA speak to both sides of the market. I mean, I suppose, you know, a lot of people perhaps as operators will see drinks companies, you know, at least having the off trade to keep them going. I mean, how important do they see a return to the on trade? It's still pretty key to most, if not all suppliers' business plans.
Yeah, I mean, massively important. It's not just because that's their profit pool, but this is also where they build their brands. So building brand association with great experiences that you just can't get at home. Suppliers understand that, and they know that the on-trade is where it's best for them to be launching products and best for them to be driving consumer interest in those products as well.
Now, finally, I think one of the things that came through our business leaders research was that a lot of business leaders are perhaps looking to sort of consolidate their ranges, reduce their ranges, particularly in drink and also food menus. In drink, but obviously there's possibly an inherent danger in that. If you reduce the choice to customers, you've got problems. But one can understand it. What's the drinks company's attitude to that? How can they work within perhaps a more restricted range?
Yeah, and I think it's all about simplicity, and we're seeing this in the States, where we're seeing a lot more ready-to-drink options that can play well for fast service, both in the outlet, but also help within that delivery space as well. I think we know that there's not going to be, you know, a bar that used to have 5 bartenders behind it, it's now going to have 2. So we need to be able to keep those things simple. There is obviously a concern that ranges will get reduced on the back of that. So they're currently trying to help their customers understand which are the core brands and categories within those ranges that are driving the volume and the value for them.
Well, excellent, Johnny. Thanks for that. We'll be getting you back probably later as we do more of these webinars as we get closer to opening, and then obviously into the autumn as well, where hopefully things start getting better. But thanks for your insight. Really appreciate it, and hopefully see you in the flesh soon as well. Take care.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Johnny. And also now we move to our special guest, someone who actually is going to be doing all this rather than the theory. Please welcome Simon Potts, the Chief Executive of The Alchemist. Simon, how are you? I haven't seen you for ages, apart from virtually, obviously.
Indeed, yeah. Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for having me. I'm pretty well, all things considered. Looking forward to, as you touched on at the start of the webinar, this idea of getting the bit between your teeth, getting back to it, the modelling and the endless forecasting that's been going on over the last couple of months, the resolve that we've had to show to make sure that we've got a healthy balance sheet and finances to see us through this period. Yeah. Now shifting into what for me is the much more exciting part of the job that I do, and that's getting under the skin of the operation, how we meet the challenges that sit ahead of us from the consumer's perspective, from the legislation perspective, and just getting into proper planning mode. It's exciting times.
And then, well, let's talk about the plans. How are you advanced? What are your plans for reopening at the moment? What are you doing? Particularly, as I said earlier, obviously a lot of talk about pubs and restaurants, but bars seem to be trickier, and you've got some pretty large establishments as well. So what's the plan?
We have, yeah. So a couple of things really. The key to all of this from day one really has been a real emphasis on flexibility, and whatever you think one day is going to be very different the next. Yeah. So whatever I kind of talk about today and the plans that we have in front of our nose are very likely to have shifted again by next week. As we stand, we're targeting that 4th of July date. We know that we're going to have a certain amount of distancing in place. There's going to be some fairly heavy sort of restrictions on the way that we deliver the operation. Most of that is in the less so the guest-facing space, but what we do in the kitchens, what we do on the bars, and how we meet the challenges from that perspective. July has also brought some good news for us in as far as the flexibility that's going to be extended to the furlough scheme. That gives us a little bit more headroom to try these things out rather than just assuming everything is going to work and running with it. So our intention at the moment is to open on that first weekend a couple of sites in Manchester and a couple in Leeds. We've got good external space in all of those venues. Our operational heartland is in both of those cities, so we can put our hands on it properly and see what we're assuming and theorising that will work is actually workable. We can also talk much more specifically to the people, the guests that are using the venue. So the hard data that CGA have been so good at supplying and all the kind of information that we use to support the business. We've got this element of soft data that we can lean on as well. After that, I think we'll have hopefully a fairly kind of rapid unwind of the estate. All the modelling that we've done says that it's infinitely better to have the sites open than closed, assuming that you're paying all the fixed costs, which obviously we're going to have to be doing at that period. I think that the second part, I suppose, in the fact that we're a bar-led business is an interesting one. I mean, we're benefiting from the fact that over the last 5 years, we've been at pains to really elongate our trading day anyway. We've got big spaces, we're paying some quite big rents. We've always been at pains to sweat the asset as best we can do. So rather than being wholly reliant on that sort of after work into late night crowd, which obviously still forms a really important part of the business, we've gone to work on the day part, looked at lunch times and making that a bit more accessible for people right around the country. And more recently, in the last couple of years, we looked at developing the breakfast offer. So I think that the fact that we're obviously going to be restricted on capacity to some degree in terms of how we trade the sites, whether that's 2 metres, whether that's 1 metre, we need to make sure that we're taking as much advantage of that as we can do. Capacity is less of an issue if you're trading 12, 14 hours at a day rather than 4 or 6 hours at a day.
Let's pick up on some of those points. I mean, you yourself, you were telling me yesterday when we were talking about this, that you're going to spend some time yourself in your sites as well, probably because you obviously miss going to bars. But actually, in a sense, obviously the CGAs of this world can provide, as you say, the hard data, but it doesn't beat talking to customers. You're going to spend a fair bit of time getting that sort of qualitative research.
Yeah, I think that's it, and teams as well obviously play an important part of that. We've got a good dialogue with those guys, and there's a lot of trust actually that the feedback we get, we get the excellent sort of twice yearly updates from CGA. Of course, we see things through our feedback partners. Wireless Social are able to provide data for us. Everyone is able to provide data, but I don't think you'd ever really be able to beat the conversations that you're going to be able to have with regular and loyal guests. We've generally got an offer, I think, that sits nicely in that bracket that Carl talked about earlier on. Slightly younger user group, a little bit more fearless, so we'll be able to leverage that fear and the location where a lot of these guys are as well, city centre dwellers, and hopefully take advantage of them as a user group to demonstrate the safety of the venues.
But also we're looking at those sort of sites as well, because that's going to be an issue for you. I mean, you're owning Media City in Manchester and obviously Spinningfields, and there's, Media City's interest is going to be obviously still working, a lot of outside space, but also you've got people living there. How important is that? Because it's going to be interesting for you about how you're judging where you open, say, compared with those sites or compared with, say, St Martin's Lane in the middle of London.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the city centre stats and the considered knowledge that's coming out, quite understandably, is people are going to be nervous about city centres. And, quite apart from anything else, you've got the public transport challenge of getting in and out of them. So we've never tried to be too reliant on one particular user group in the venues. We've got a good makeup of 4 main users. Local residents, city centre dwellers, that young crowd that are living in flats generally around the centres, shoppers, which we hope will be back to some extent, and hopefully those shopping centre environments particularly are going to be quite well protected. You can get to them in your own car, you can park, you can do everything under one roof, so that's useful. Then we would look at office workers. I think we can be pretty confident that they're not going to be back in any great numbers, but for some time now in the actual office environment. And if they're going through the pain of sort of socially distant travelling into work and then, of course, adhering to those rules in the office, you're hardly likely to risk that in a more social environment later on. So we've got to be cautious about that. And then tourism, and less the sort of overseas tourism. It's more the entertainment tourism that sits around a lot of the venues. So match days for football, gigs at big venues in the big regional city centres. Theatres obviously are a big part of that. All of those things are going to be a long, long way down the line before they're back to life. So it's that sort of incidental footfall. It's not necessarily the capacity issue or the local residents that are going to be supportive. It's what generally pushes the numbers along on top of your bread and butter that gives us a bit of pause for thought at the moment.
What sort of assumptions are you making on that in terms of how you're phasing opening? I mean, remind us, how many sites have you potentially, have you got and potentially going to open?
Yeah, so we've got 20 venues, and the intention will be to get them all open up ultimately. But yeah,
that's an important one, because obviously a lot of operators, even in business leaders, 30% of people in your position said they won't reopen all sites. So you're confident you will?
Yeah, I think in the main, we've got long leases ahead of us. We've been fairly focused in the way that we've gone about site acquisition. A lot of that obviously relies, particularly lately, on London in particular coming back to life. But it's very difficult ultimately to imagine a world where London doesn't, continue to be a fairly kind of beating heart, important global city, let alone, the capital here. So I think in time it will start to unravel, and so much of it is tied to how people feel about it. And it's no wonder really, you ask people today how they feel they're going to behave, as a consumer. There's obviously going to be fear around going out. We've only just been told we can see more than one person from our household outside. But if that message continues to unwind and that fear sort of lessens over the next 4 or 5 weeks, and we can use that group when we get to that opening weekend to demonstrate that the space is safe, then people will come back in time. And the nighttime economy, it might not be back at quite the same level, the gig economy.
Have you got assumptions and sort of in terms of what you're expecting to phase back? Because obviously you've got those first 4, that will give you a fair bit of research and feedback. But have you a plan, or is it really flexible at the moment? How flexible is it?
Yeah, keeping it very flexible. We'll be keen to we'll have key sites. We're doubled up in quite a lot of cities, and particularly in London. I think the energy initially will be making sure that there is a decent chunk of residential population around the space. So Canary Wharf, oddly, although on the immediate campus there's obviously not a lot of residents, there's quite a bit of a catchment area around it when you go over the water to Greenwich. Embassy Gardens will be another site that's quite interesting. Fairly busy down there at the moment already, one way or the other. Yeah, and generally we'll be looking for that blend of. We're fortunate really. The venues are quite big. They're mostly later seating anyway, even in the bar space. So we've got room to hit that kind of distancing requirement in most of the venues. Outside areas are obviously going to be important, so just a little bit more room to breathe. Obviously, we're not relying on a great British summer. It's been pretty good so far, but whether that's still God's law. But obviously people are going to feel a little bit more comfortable outdoors. Some of that technology that's been touched on earlier, the ability to order from table, digital menus and so on is important. And I think, where we've got space, where we've got outside areas to trade from, and where we've got a residential and a reasonable shot at that footfall community. We're in a lot of shopping centres. I think they'll be okay. The IKEA queues are telling you everything you need to know about people's confidence.
That's true, yeah. You could do a pop actually in the middle of those queues, couldn't you, really?
So the areas that we're going to be a bit more cautious about, I suppose, are the more sort of business located. Our Bevis Marks venue off Liverpool Street is an obvious example. St Martin's Lane will probably be another one that is just going to give us a little bit of pause for thought, and it's where what that commercial environment looks like, less the capacity issue and the consumer behaviour, but what is fundamentally there around us.
Yeah, so you'll be monitoring that. How are you communicating with your consumers as you're being closed? Are you keeping that communication open? Because obviously one of the things you have been doing, and actually someone asked us a question about brand extension and Coat at Home was mentioned, but you'll be doing cocktails at home. Two questions there. Is that part of that communication, and is that something you're going to be keep doing?
Yeah, definitely. I think, if you remember back in March, we were getting emails from every organisation you'd ever signed up to, telling you what they were doing in response to COVID. So we've kind of dealt with all that now. We've not been too heavy on the databases. I don't think people need a real kind of slew of information through that at the minute, because there isn't a whole lot to tell them. The venues are shut, everyone knows.
And there's a lot of people saying the obvious, isn't there, out there at the moment? Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. What we've done a little bit more keenly is focused on the social media element of the brand. It's always been a really important part of what we've done, but we've tried to turn that into something a bit more accessible. So lots of work about how to do cocktails from home, demonstrations and examples of people doing that in their own environments. We've partnered with a couple of quite interesting brands who have helped to sort of amplify that. So businesses, online retail, people like Pretty Little Thing, and a group in Spain actually called Oisho, who have supported that at a more kind of corporate level, and that's been good. We have been trialling a click and collect cocktail service at a couple of those residential venues. We talked about Media City and also in Embassy Gardens. That's something that's worked really well. The demand's been great and operationally very smooth. At the moment, while the venues are closed and the sort of labour intensity that goes with it, it's not a particularly viable option. It's something we wanted to have ready for when the venues are opened, because we know we're not coming back to those sort of revenue levels that we've been experiencing pre-COVID for many months, undoubtedly. We know that there are going to be some behaviours that are going to be quite deep-rooted with the users. So alongside our main brand, we want to make sure that we've got something that can augment the usual revenue channels. And I think having a good click and collect offer, taking advantage of people that want to do home entertainment, who are cooking at home, who might be, buying their meals from Coat, as we just touched on there. Perhaps they'll buy their cocktails from us and put the two together to create that environment. And actually, in the ordinary world, it's not unusual for people to go to, a meal at, we're next door to the Ivy, and quite a few of our locations, they'll be having a bite to eat there, and they'll come to us for a drink afterwards. So we're just finding a way of doing that same sort of behaviour, but in people's homes.
Yeah, well, I've got some questions coming up, and that sort of leads on from that about exactly what is your marketing plan for reopening, without giving away all your secrets.
Yeah, I think that clearly the most sort of important note that the consumers are looking for is good standards of hygiene. And for those of us who are in the restaurant and bar sector, it's just totally subconscious part of what we do. We're licensed venues. We're controlled by the Health and Safety Executive, the Food Standards Agency. We're one of the safest sectors that you can actually come into as a consumer. All of our venues are 5-star AHA rated, and I think what we need to do is leverage the fact that we've always had cleanliness very close to our hearts, and we just need to make sure that the consumers understand that. Will be, the examples that have been set by people like Open Inns and Albert Schloss up here in Manchester recently about how they're going to make their venues COVID secure for people. Once we've got a confirmed date to get after, and we're a little bit closer to it, we'll be sending that whole message out through the databases to say, this is what we're doing. We're actually expecting demand to be really high, so we're encouraging you to book here. Yeah. We expect really to be going into that opening weekend and that first phase with pretty sort of strong sense of demand and what's happening. It may well be a dead cat bounce that there might be time for that to normalise, but I think we'll be able to get back to the operation fairly quickly. And again, looking at the retail world, IKEA is great. We've all loved it for many years, but a 5-mile queue this morning is just bananas.
It's almost in Parliament. Exactly, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I think there is, there's just making sure that we are being clear about what we're doing in site. We don't want it to look and feel like an ICU unit. It needs to be the escapism that it's always been. It's taking you away from work or home life. It needs to feel different. It just that surety of safeness, and I think that will settle quite quickly. And then it will be the stuff that we've always done. Having what we feel to be a unique and fairly exciting proposition. It's good to hear that people still want that value for experience, and experiential will have to be rethought in certain senses, but it's still going to matter. So we're continuing to focus on that. We're not trying to pivot anything away from what we've done for the last 5 years, really. It's just, it becomes ever more important to be different.
Well, a couple of the last questions, because I'm conscious of time and we're a bit over, but we've got a bit of flexibility, as long as you haven't got lunch to go to. What about your workforce? Are you bringing people off furlough already? And what are your plans for getting those guys up to speed?
Yeah, we've obviously, as everyone has, the majority of our teams have been furloughed, but we remain quite open and communicative as a business. We've got lots of different ways of doing that, and we've got a good hierarchy at work that's sort of helping to push those messages downhill. So the senior team that will make everything happen will be back off furlough in the next couple of weeks, and getting under the bones of what needs to happen in the run up to it. I don't think we're a system-led, process-driven business. We're not going to have a huge amount of difficulty, I think, getting the sites reanimated. We've kept up conversation with suppliers. We know where we are with that. We've got, payment terms agreed where appropriate. We know what we need to do to refire the sites. So I think we've got a team primed and ready to go. To that point earlier on, I think the flexibility that's been offered in July, everything is pretty hypothetical at the moment. And if we open 4 of those venues and they fall flat on their face, then we're going to need to go back to the drawing board fairly quickly. So there will be a phasing of the team back in. Obviously, venues that aren't going to open that weekend, the teams will be kept back while we've still got that flexibility, and that will be the same centrally as well. We just the government, in some regards, have been really good in that support. I mean, the onus is on us as responsible business leaders to take advantage of that as best we can do in the most sensible way, and keep those levels of communication going to the teams that sit back.
You mentioned suppliers. What do you expect? What would you like from particularly drink suppliers? Because we've got a lot in the audience today, and they're still here as well, I can tell.
Yeah,
so,
really good. The point that Johnny touched on there really is, I think, in terms of volume, perhaps the on-trade is not quite as important as the off, but what's so vital for them, and has always been the case, is the ability to amplify their brands through that. Always, we've worked with lots of really good partners in that regard. The idea of creating incentives and events and reasons for people to come through the door have been good, and it works both ways. We like to think we've got a fairly interesting sort of brand proposition, and spirit suppliers want to be part of that conversation and standing with the cool kids, I suppose. The specific conversations I've had with some of our key partners have been less around the energy needed to really push people through the doors. Certainly initially, I don't think we're going to have too much trouble doing that ourselves. I think energy is better spent on what they can do to help us augment those revenue streams. So we're thinking a bit around the idea of developing more keenly our retail offer. So what they can do with their supply lines as far as that goes, and things like bottling and packaging obviously is part of that, and that's really interesting. And then I suppose just the way of animating sites, particularly in London, there's a lot of talk about getting better use of external spaces around the venues, or slightly off campus even. And if they've got a lot of sort of pop-up bars and tables and chairs and so on that are going to waste from the festival scene that isn't happening in summer, then is there something we can do with that as well? So yeah, I think it's about ideas and innovation, as it always is with those guys. And yeah, looking forward to getting under the skin of that a little bit over the next few weeks as well in readiness.
Well, bearing in mind we've heard some sort of changes about consumer attitudes, whatever. Obviously, it's the safety is important. Are we going to see anything new and exciting coming out of the Alchemist as a result of this, or do we have to wait to July the 4th?
I don't think we're going to be doing anything too out there initially. I think we've got a pretty credible offer. Again, the fact that we've got this unique, fairly theatrical and interesting cocktail proposition, and people haven't been able to recreate that in their homes, that should give us something to get after. We've always got things happening under the skins. We're asking our development teams to think a little bit more keenly about some of the stuff that they might have shied away from in the past, because volume has been a problem in terms of creating a particular drink or a particular serve. That if that issue is going to be less there because we aren't going to have people 4 and 5 deep at the bar for a bit, then perhaps we can get after some of the more interesting things. So there'll be plenty to come, I'm sure. And in the short term, some of the developments that we've had around technology, particularly, we'll look to move up the chain, because consumers are going to need that, and it's the perfect time to be to make digital menus and so on. And yeah, that's the area we'll focus on.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and a lot of it is going to be new. But Simon, look, thanks for spending time with us today. Normally in these circumstances where it's live, you have a round of applause, but you'll just have to be mad.
Thank you.
But thanks, and hope to see you again. Hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye. Well, thanks to Simon, and thanks to all our panelists today, to Emma, to Carl, and to Johnny, and particularly to Emma and Wireless Social for supporting us today. I hope that's been useful for you guys out there. And I see there's quite a lot of you still online, even if we are a little late, but I think it was worthwhile hearing from Simon about what he's going to be doing on the front line, particularly in that really competitive bar market. But there's obviously a lot of optimism coming from him. I mean, I think what's clear is coming through is that robust planning is going to be needed in the next few weeks, and that will require reliable and up-to-the-minute intelligence from a number of sources. Obviously, people like Wireless Social and CGA, but obviously your own suppliers of more micro data as we move not just through this next 30 days as we see new legislation coming out of government potentially, but also when consumers hopefully start coming through our doors. We're going to be around. We'll be back with some more data. We've got our next brand track data of consumers coming online later this month, so we'll be back then. We're working with Wireless Social. Our market recovery monitor will be up and running as soon as the doors open, and hopefully so will Copper Peach Business Tracker to provide some real data. There's going to be some real tough decisions going to be made out there, and recovery no doubt will take time and it won't be smooth. But thank you all for joining us today, and very good luck. Hope to see you all very soon. Thank you very much. Bye.